This is the first of who knows how many videos of me making a 1/12 scale model of how I want to remodel our kitchen. Today's topic, the floor and walls.
In a world, a tiny, miniature world that exists only in her imagination.
Hi y'all, I'm Tippy Cow. MiniMakerSal asked me to narrate this video so she can focus on her mini making. So let's get started. First, some history. A few years ago, Sal decided she wanted to make a model of how she wanted to remodel her kitchen. Finally, a few months ago, she got around to measuring her kitchen floor, walls, windows, doorways, appliances, and even the placement of outlets and switches. This is her schematic she drew up and has since made notes all over. MiniMakerSal started making the 12th scale model a few times. She had only done the floors and walls as you see here in her last effort. Then she told her brother how she'd be going to YouTube school to learn more about mini making, and he suggested she make a video about it. "Oh, Mike," she whined. "I was just going to put photos and a bit of info on my website about it." Well, we know she decided to go with his suggestion. Well, here we are several weeks later, and Sal learned a bit about video and audio editing. She made a couple videos, and here we are documenting a real project. Finally! Here are some views of Sal's real kitchen that she really wants to remodel. It is quite functional, but ugly with all those industrial shelving units and cabinets from 1978 when the house was built. And her mini model is just the thing she thinks will get her husband interested in the do-over. Before doing any of the fun stuff, Sal had her wonderful neighbor Dennis cut out the walls and the base supports as you see here. He already had his saws set up. Sal primed the floor and wall surfaces, then put brackets at the upper corners to fit it all together. She made this so it can be taken apart and each piece worked on as needed. Now let's see what Sal did with the floor. She first drew diagonal lines on a piece of canvas, which are where the grout lines are around the tiles. Then she put a thin coat of gesso down and went over the grout lines with a black Sharpie. She painted it all with a terracotta colored acrylic paint thin enough to see the grout lines through. Using the various colors in her real kitchen floor, she painted within the lines of the diamond boxes in a random pattern. For colors that weren't quite right, like this ochre color, she did a wash of paint over it to get it closer to reality. And this is a bit of her real kitchen floor. After all was dry, Sal went over the grout lines once again with the black Sharpie. She cut the canvas to the correct size and glued it with Mod Podge to the wooden base of the model.
Tippy tip.
When using paint from a 1/4 smaller can, poke 2 holes in the lid across from each other using an awl. Make each hole just large enough to screw in an eye screw, and the bigger the screw the better for quicker pouring. Then when you are going to use some of the paint, shake the can vigorously to stir it up and remove the eye screws and pour just what you'll currently need into a small container. When done pouring, you will likely have to wipe a teeny bit of paint from around the pouring hole, but not as much as when you remove the entire lid. Screw the hardware back into the lid and your paint will stay wet for a long time. And here's what MiniMakerSal did with the walls. First she painted all the surfaces that weren't going to be inner walls with a black chalk paint. To make bricks right on the walls, Sal mixed up some spackling compound with Mod Podge. She did about 4 parts spackle with 1 part Mod Podge. When it dried, she discovered a 10-to-1 part mix would have been much easier to work with, as the surface wouldn't have been so hard. An uneven layer of this mixture was spread on the 2 brick walls. This was about a 32nd of an inch, or about 1 millimeter thick. The real walls are slump block, which are rough concrete blocks, 4 inches by 16 inches. I'll show you a close-up of the real wall shortly. About a half an hour after laying the mixture down, Sal texturized the surface with a ruffled shop cloth to create some brick-like texture in the spackle mix. Because the mixture flattened out as it was drying, Sal had to texturize it again 15 minutes after that, and again another 15 minutes later. Using a metal skewer, Sal etched the mortar lines into the walls. This is when she figured out she should have used less Mod Podge because she had to scrape so hard to cut into the rock-like compound. She did the same for etching the vertical mortar lines. When the etching was done, she sanded the pointy bumps down and brushed off the crumbs so she could paint on those walls. Let's go back to MiniMakerSal. Sometimes I do things in the wrong order, like this. After my brick making, I finally did an experiment to figure out what Mod Podge spackle mixture works better for making my mini slump block bricks. I first spread some plain spackle on a board, then mixed up a 10-part Mod Podge to 1-part spackle combination and laid that down, then did a 4-part Mod Podge to 1-part spackle combo and laid that down. The reason I mix Mod Podge into the spackle is that it dries far more solid than spackle alone. My next step was to add texture to the compounds using an old beat-up shop cloth that has a rough texture. This is my first try at texturizing at about 15 minutes after laying the spackle compound down. That was far too soon. I did the texturizing thing again a few times with 5 or 10 minutes in between each session. If I were to do this again, I'd probably do the plain spackle texturizing at about 30 minutes. And for the 10-to-1 and 4-to-1 mixtures, it took about 45 minutes from the beginning for the texture to be right. So I do the first texture temp on the compounds at the 30-minute mark, then again at the 45-minute mark. Then I'd let it all sit for an hour or two to get good and dry. The next day I finally got around to etching the dried spackle and spackle Mod Podge concoctions. I used an awl, which was easier to use than the skewer I'd used on the real mini walls. I did 2 passes on the plain spackle, 4 on the 10-to-1 mix, and 7 on the 4-to-1 mix to get the mortar lines as deep as I wanted. These photos show a close-up of the mortar etching in the 10-to-1 mix. The top one is just the etching. On the bottom photo, I went over the etched horizontal lines with a pencil so I could more easily see where to etch the vertical lines. So that was my belated experiment. Mostly I learned that it's better to experiment ahead of time than doing things on a guess. I will definitely incorporate experimentation into my process. Now back to Tippy. For her west brick wall, Sal chose a pale olive green color, which she thinks will look good in real life. She used an old paintbrush to get into all the nooks and crannies. That olive color sure looks nice and very southwest. This is Sal's real brick wall in a boring off-white. And this is a close-up of the mini wall. Sal mixed up a pale adobe color paint for the other 3 kitchen walls. I'm sure she wishes she could paint things this quickly. And the walls are painted and ready to go, or so she thought. When she set the walls up on the base, Sal realized the thickness of the bricks prevented the walls from fitting right, so she taped off guides to where she had to scrape off the excess. After filing and sanding that off, she painted the ends so they wouldn't show the primer upon close inspection. Finally, MiniMakerSal's mini kitchen walls are all standing up and fitting together. Looks like this phase is done, though Sal says she's going to Mod Podge the inner walls because that makes a good clear coat to prevent the paint from scraping off as she works further. Just before Sal coated the inner walls with the Mod Podge, she decided to put the outlets and switches in place. You see here that on the brick walls, she had to carve out the spaces for these. She of course touched up the paint as needed. I'm going to now make a sliding patio door and the window, so those will be in the next Real Kitchen Remodel miniature video. Thank you for watching and learning with me, and in particular thanks to Mike, Jay, Kyle, and Dennis. Please like and subscribe to MiniMakerSal, and be sure to leave me a comment. See you next time.